Today I want to cover the topic of moral relativism with respect to the three classes. So we're going to start out with the warrior class and then progress to the priest and the merchant class and looking how they view the concept of moral relativism. Moral relativism is basically the idea that morality is a set of rules that leads to a certain outcome. So I've talked about the three different desirable moral outcomes, the three different traditions. You have the ascetic tradition, which says that the best moral outcome is to become detached from reality, to seek out simplicity, and that divinity or nirvana really means the absence of distinction between infinity and nothingness. And so when you reach that state of enlightenment and that disattachment from the material world, then you are achieving some kind of nirvana, some kind of enlightenment, some kind of unity with divinity, and that aspect is there in Christianity, that aspect is present in Islam, that aspect is present in perennialism. So then we also have the desire for beauty, for aesthetics, the desire for beautiful art. This is the Western tradition. The realism of painting, the realism of sculpture, something that starts in Minoan culture, possibly in ancient Balkan culture, the pre-Indo-European culture of the Balkans, that I'll have to do another video on. But whatever its origin, you see it reflected in Egyptian realism, in early Greek realism, and then Greco-Roman realism, and then manifesting in the European Renaissance. It's a level of realism that has never been seen any other area of the world other than essentially the Mediterranean and the European sphere. This is where we see this level of visual realism. We also see it in terms of music and the history of Western music. You know, I'm not an expert in music theory, but clearly there's a difference between European classical music and the classical music of other cultures. There's an intense complexity to it. Now, there might be some other cultures that have complex musical patterns. You know, I'm sure there's some African drummers who have some very complex rhythms. However, they're not really concerned with writing down these rhythms and codifying the rhythms. In the West, there was this extreme focus upon being able to write down a musical system. As far as I know, the West is the first culture to actually write down, create a musical notation system rather than doing it by ear and doing it according to an oral tradition or an auditory tradition. They're doing according to a written tradition, which is a novel thing. Then besides aesthetics, the aesthetics, visual aesthetics, auditory aesthetics, that as an ideal of, you know, God being beauty, visual beauty or beauty of music. Then you also have the concept of architecture, the unity, the harmony of architectural spaces. Again, you see other architectural traditions around the world, but the diversity of architectural traditions in the West, again, the focus that Westerners put upon architecture is a little bit different than you go to Japan. Okay, there's a Japanese style, there's a Chinese style, there's the Taj Mahal, there's an Indian tradition, and whatnot. I'm sure there's some sort of African artistic or architectural tradition. There, you know, the Middle Eastern Islamic architectural tradition. You have people building pyramids in Southern America, Central America. So obviously architecture is present in other cultures, but the fanaticism with which Westerners tried to continually improve their architecture and make it mean something and have it reflect a sense of divinity is important. Okay, so the first one being asceticism, the second one being aesthetics, the third one would then be survivalism, the desire to survive. And so we could look at a religion like Judaism. Judaism has a concept of God as nothingness. I think the Hebrew term is El Sof or I Sof or something like that. That God is nothingness, that you can't describe God, you can't pin down God, there's no incarnation of God, God is beyond the material realm. And so there is a kind of asceticism implicit within that idea, a kind of perennialism in that idea. But then, Judaism is obviously, the relationship between God and the Jewish people is very important, and so there is a survivalism implicit there, that basically whatever is done to advance the survivalism of the Jewish people is good. And that is something that is reflected in a lot of warrior cultures, that whatever leads you to win the battle is good. And so Sun Tzu is not just a political thinker, but he's also somewhat a religious figure, in that he prescribes certain values of not just how to win in warfare, but how to win in all sorts of areas of life, how to win in business, how to win in your relationships. So the ethic of whatever wins is best is another way of looking at morality, and it's something that is that sort of unites the warrior class with the merchant class. The priest class can sort of be abstract and say, well, we think that God is nothingness, or we think that nirvana is disattachment or something. So the priest class can sort of go off and venture beyond what it means to survive. I mean, the priest class can be celibate, whereas the warrior class and the merchant class are more constrained by practical realities of what actually works. And so a warrior class, one of the interesting things about a warrior class, when we think about a militant society, we think about the military, a very interesting word is the word uniform. When we say the word uniform, often we think of a military uniform, a police uniform, some sort of martial uniform. And it's an interesting word because uniform itself means that all should be, we should all fit into one mold. Uni meaning one, and form meaning the physical form, the mold. And so the uniform really means that there should be a unity of purpose in a warrior class. That a warrior class ideally should be united, it should cooperate, should work together as one organic unit. Now, of course, there's specialization. This has always been around. You might have someone who's an archer, someone who is has a spear, someone who has a gun, someone who's a tactician, someone who's a strategist, someone who forges the armor. So there's all different parts of an army, but fundamentally they all work toward one purpose. And so when we think about what is the resultant morality of a warrior culture is going to be a majoritarian culture. A warrior culture is going to want a sort of uniformity of purpose within the overall culture. A warrior culture is not a culture that's going to tolerate multiculturalism. A warrior culture is going to be a culture that says we need to have unity of purpose, unity of morale. We need to all be one in-group in our society. And so anyone who is outside of that is not really tolerated. Anyone who says, like, hey, maybe we should go a different way, because when you're in that battle, you need everyone on the same team, you need everyone on the same page. Even though people are performing different tasks, they still all need to ultimately be united. They can't be fighting amongst each other. Competition is seen as a healthy thing in a warrior society, that you have competition, you have battles, you have training, sparring, testing one another. But when the ultimate test comes, when the actual war starts, there's a friend-enemy distinction. You say, okay, we have to eliminate a certain level of moral competition. There has to be a moral code, a code of honor, of duty, that necessitates the ultimate loyalty of the soldiers to the in-group. That you can't ever question it. You can't ever think, well, sure, I'm part of this in-group, but maybe we're really the bad guys, or maybe we should have some self-criticism. Again, it's not that there's no aspect of self-criticism. Of course, some element of self-criticism is necessary in any kind of physical training. If you're trying to build up your physique, you have to be self-critical and say, where are my weaknesses? What do I need to work on? Same thing with an army unit or military unit. So there is a level of self-criticism, but at the end of the day, there are limits to self-criticism. And so that the resultant worldview is a kind of moral objectivity, that there is a certain best way, that a military unit or a militaristic society is ultimately looking toward what is the best way to structure ourselves in order to win wars. That's how the National Socialists saw themselves. They said war is the ultimate test of whether a culture is good or bad. And so we need to develop warrior virtues, and there's a kind of ultimate culture. There's an objective morality that we're seeking toward this telos of being the perfect warrior culture where all Germans are united. We all have, one leader, one people, one blood. We're all on the same page. We're all on the same team. Again, there was a level of competition. There was a level of certainly in training, you would look for weakness. There would be a certain level of self-criticism, but at the end of the day, everyone needed to be on the same page, on the same team. There needed to be a homogeneity. It was certainly majoritarian. And so that's an extreme recent manifestation. Now, of course, Nazism lost in 1945. So what is the alternative here? We've talked about the priestly morality being a little more abstract, being a little more divorced from survival as such, but there is a merchant morality. And the merchant morality is not the same as the warrior morality. Because in merchandising, certainly there are things that help a merchant succeed. Things like charisma, mathematical ability. We could just say generally, if you're working with money, you need to be able to count money. You need to get people to work with you, to trust with you. You need to have some basic level of sociability to be able to work with other people. So there are certain traits that lend itself to merchandising: a high verbal IQ, some level of mathematical ability, certainly the ability to think quickly, to outthink not necessarily your opponent, but your trading partner, to always be looking for the better deal. There are a lot of traits that help someone ascend the ranks of a merchant class. But a merchandising society, a society based around the principle of merchandising, is a lot more morally fluid and a lot more morally relativistic than a warrior society. A priest society, in theory, can be morally relativistic in the sense that you can have many different cults. And of course, the Roman world did have many different cults, and there were certain cults that were legal and certain cults that were illegal. And so the legal cults had a legal status within Rome. They had official temples within Rome and the Italian peninsula. And then there were some cults which were considered to be not legal. They were considered to not be official cults, and they were exiled to the provinces. And so there was a level of religious tolerance, but there were certain cults that were favored and certain cults that were not favored, and that were parochial cults in the provinces. So there was a level of religious tolerance, but within each cult, there was a clear doctrine. Okay, this is how you ascend the ranks of this cult. This is what is profane. This is what is esoteric. So there were all different levels of the sacred, and within each cult there were rules. And I suppose you could say that for the business world there's a similar thing, where instead of the entire market viewing itself as one unit, each sector of the market has different rules, and within each sector of the market there are different businesses that are in competition with one another, and they might have different styles and different approaches that work at different times. So one company might say, okay, we want slow, sustained growth. We don't want to advance quickly. We want to invest safely. We want to invest our resources safely and slowly and surely, and then eventually work our way up. And another business might say something like, well, we want to advance quickly. We want to make risky investments, but hopefully they'll pay off. So, I mean, you can see that some of this in the warrior world, that you could have different specialty units, but ultimately the distinction here is the unity of purpose. That in the Roman world, there was a distinction of purpose between different cults. Some cults might cooperate. There might be an overall pantheon that encompass all of these different cults. But there's a distinction between the unity of purpose and the concept of in-group. That distinct cults do allow for the creation of distinct in-groups. a militaristic society really has one in-group, one dominant majoritarian group that rules over the others in a clear hierarchy. A merchandising society does not necessarily have this in place, and so you can have elites at the top of society. Jeff Bezos could be one of the elites of a merchandising society, but if he should fall, if he should stumble, then someone's going to come up and replace him, and the outlook, the worldview of that person might be completely different. You know, Jeff Bezos is supposed to be a Mexican-Scandinavian mix or something, theoretically. And, you know, his worldview, his cultural background, the way he does business could be completely different from the newcomer who supplants him. So, you know, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, these people don't necessarily come from wealthy families. These people don't necessarily come from elite families. The next question I have to ask about this merchandising society, or at least the way that it appears, because so far I've just described the way that things appear. I haven't gotten conspiratorial. But we could explore the conspiratorial option. We could say that if I was rich and I was powerful, the first thing I would do is I would never want to be on a Forbes 500 list of the richest people. I wouldn't want to appear, because the moment that you appear to the public, you make yourself vulnerable. Any kind of appearance, any kind of visibility has an implicit accountability. So George Soros is a very visible person, and therefore the public's very angry at him. And that there's a kind of danger and a risk for George Soros. I mean, who's to say that some crazy guy with a gun doesn't do something terrible and illegal to George Soros? I would never advocate that. But, you know, if that happened, that would be a danger to George Soros. If I was George Soros, I wouldn't want to be visible. I would want to be secret. I would want to hide in the shadows. And I think if you're sufficiently powerful enough, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to do that. You could hide your wealth. There are many different mechanisms to hide wealth. You know, different bank accounts and things like that. And so basically when the conspiratorial angle looks at the richest people like Mark Zuckerberg and says, Mark Zuckerberg is not the most powerful man in the world, Jeff Bezos is not the most powerful man in the world. These people are they're the figureheads, right? When people ask, who's the richest people? Well, they point to Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. Are these really the most powerful people? Well, the conspiratorial view would say, no, they aren't. They're just the front men. They're just the people who are put out there to make it look like these are the rulers of a merchandising society, when in fact they are not. When in fact the rulers perhaps are people who are more of a hereditary family line, right? People who are descended from other powerful people, and then they put up these front men to give the appearance of a meritocracy. So that's entirely possible. Of course, I don't have any special knowledge about who these families are, or any more than you do. I don't have access to them. I don't have personal experience with them. You know, I could look up some conspiratorial website online, but so could you. And so our access to that knowledge here is basically equal, and I can't say any more than you can. But certainly it's an interesting theory. But I do want to get back to the appearance of our merchandising society, that whether or not there is a hidden cult of 12 or an elder council that really controls the world, that really has influence, and that these other people are just figureheads. Whether or not that's true, the perception of leadership is still important for how mass morality is formed. Because if you live in a militaristic Nazi society, the average person is going to view morality as this objective thing. Like, of course, we have to be unified as a people. We have to have one leader, one blood, one vision. We have to have a hierarchy. We have to have a certain level of competition. We have to have a certain level of self-criticism. But ultimately, we are the dominant in-group. We are in charge. There is a very unipolar world within the society. The appearance of our merchandising society, whether it is true or not true, that's a different conversation. What I'm trying to point out here is that when you have the appearance of a merchandising society, whether it's ruled by secret priests and cults and religious figures or whatever, demons or angels, I don't care. The appearance to people, the secular appearance, is that morality is kind of just relative. It's kind of like, well, it used to be that Henry Ford was very rich, but now the sort of style of Henry Ford is out of style, and now it's Mark Zuckerberg who's very rich. So times are changing, and times will continue to change, and so there really is no moral grounding. There's no in-group that we can point to. There's no unipolarity. It's very much a polycentric model. And to end this video, I do want to touch upon the concept of polycentric law and esoteric Marxism. Now, when people talk about the Soviet Union, they talk about a state which wanted to invade other nation states in order to create an international organization of communism. Now, obviously, Soviet Union is over, but what we've had replacing the Soviet Union is, instead of having an internationalism where one nation state gobbles up other nation states, which is sort of the Soviet model, instead you have a nation state like France, which invites in multinationals. The French state invites in Muslims. This French state then allows these Muslims to have a parallel law to the secular state. And so you create a kind of polycentric law where there is already an international legal system within the state of France. It's not just French secular law, but it's also Islamic law. And there's no reason why you couldn't add other tertiary systems into this overall nation-state legal system. It's no longer a nation-state. France is now an international state, and that is a political reality. Now, theoretically, white nationalists would like to reverse that. I'm saying that's not going to happen. I'm saying let's deal with the polycentrism of the future, and let's create our own in-group within this polycentric system that can compete with other in-groups within the polycentric system, rather than trying to form our own new ethno-state that the white nationalists want to do. But this model, instead of gobbling up nation states, you bring other nations into your state, effectively making it a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multinational entity. It is a superstate. So France today is not a nation state, it's a superstate. Germany is not a nation state, it's a superstate. It's a state containing multiple nations. Now, the advantage of this from a globalist perspective is that once you make a state truly multinational, then it's a very easy thing to then integrate the governments of France and Germany, because they're already multinational states. They already have two different peoples with two different religions, two different outlooks, two different demographic contents, fertility rates, everything's different. And so to integrate then, and in fact this is what white nationalism does to a degree, and there are different views of white nationalism. Is it pan-European, or is it parochially ethnic? Is it petty nationalism, or grandiose ethnic, or grandiose racial pan-European nationalism? Those are two kind of in conflict ideologies within white nationalism. But when you bring Muslims into France and you bring Muslims into Germany, then white French and white Germans and Christian French and Christian Germans sort of look at each other and they say, hey, we French and we Germans actually have more in common than we thought. We're more similar than we thought. We should work together against these Muslims living in our countries. So there is an internationalism in this. And Marxism has always aligned itself with racialism. If you look at the writings of anarchists, and you look at the writings of Marx, and I'll have to pull them up someday in a very historically dense video, but I'll look them up if someone wants to challenge me in the comments of people. The first instances of the term racism were not negative. Marxists and anarchists talked about racism as a necessary step toward internationalism. That initially you have states ruled by an aristocratic warrior class and principalities. They have ultimate autonomy. We need to break that down in favor of meritocracy. And the first way we can break that down was nationalist populism. 1848 revolution. So liberal nationalism broke down the autonomy of the principalities. And there was a step toward globalism, a step toward internationalism. Internationalism and globalism is always viewed by anarchists and Marxists as the fusion of smaller units into larger units. And that is how they view nationalism and racism. And so Marxists are racist in their orientation, at least originally. Now, today, we think of Marxism as anti-racist, because of people like Trotsky. When Marxism actually became part of a state ideology rather than just a free-floating intellectual pursuit or an intellectual experiment, Trotsky started stamping down on racism within the Soviet Union. He said the Ukrainians are racist and we need to stop them. Now, people can think of that as a contradiction, but it's actually not a contradiction. See, racism and nationalism was used to break down the old order of Europe to bring in a new order that would be more amenable. It would be a larger scale system. The nation state is larger than a principality, and it's more populist, and it can be more easily morphed into a global communist system than a traditional warrior aristocracy Christian Europe. So shifting the locus of power away from the church and the aristocracy, shifting it toward the populist masses, is a lot more amenable to eventual communist takeover. That was their view. I think it's correct. And so within the Soviet Union, they wanted to stamp out racism because they said, hey, we already won. We don't need racism anymore. So the way they view racism or tribalism is something that you use at first to gain power, and then once you have power, you start stamping down on the racism because it harms the overall unity of your communist or socialist state. And that's essentially what we've seen, is that time and time again, racism, nationalism, populism is used to bring us one step toward globalism, and then once that system's actually established, then racism is constantly stamped out and oppressed. People think of it as a contradiction, but really it's a dialectic that Marxists and anarchists have been talking about since the 19th century, and it's continued to accelerate and progress as time has gone on. So we're seeing what I would say is not a shift from economic Marxism to cultural Marxism. I think that's, again, a problematic term, because if you oppose cultural Marxism, then what does it mean? Do you embrace cultural individualism? Well, that's a terrible position. I'd much rather be a cultural Marxist than a cultural individualist. But what I think we're actually seeing, I think a better semantic is to say that we're shifting from exoteric Marxism to esoteric Marxism. Exoteric Marxism is the Marxist state, the Soviet Union, gobbles up neighboring nation states, and in that way creates global communism. That was Trotsky's view, and Stalin implemented it to a degree. And there was also an international component supporting communist states in Africa and whatnot. But now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, rather than gobbling up neighboring nation states, the model is instead to invite foreign nationals into the state, to internationalize the nation state itself, to bring it to an international polycentric legal system where Sharia law and secular law can coexist, where you can have extreme Muslim conservatives having their own legal system in their own neighborhood, and then extreme pornographic bestiality. And this is, nowhere better seen than Sweden. Sweden, I think Sweden and Denmark, the Nordic countries, they've legalized bestiality. I think the Netherlands, the age of consent is like 12 or something ridiculously low. I mean, these people are extremely liberal and morally relativistic, and yet they have these extremely conservative Muslims. And so if you think that's sustainable or not, we already de facto have a polycentric legal system. And that's going to be the case for a while, in the same way that ethno-states and nation-states were the case for a while. For the 19th, 20th century, we lived in a world of ethno-states and nation-states. Since 1965, those have started to go down and down and down the toilet as multinationals are invited into the nation-state in a form of esoteric Marxism. What I mean by esoteric is not it's secret, but what I mean, although there could be a secret component to it, what I mean is that instead of exoteric is you're seeking to move your military outside of the state and conquering neighboring states. Esoteric means you bring it within. So here the boundary, this is the state, are the circle and the terra, right? And then the eso means within, exo means without. So the Soviet Marxism was viewed, it was exoteric, it was outward looking, whereas esoteric Marxism in Europe today is viewed, we don't need to go outside, conquer foreign states, we need to bring foreign peoples into our state, and that's how we'll create an ideology of internationalism, and then we can eventually export it once we've fully cooked our internationalism within our own state. We've perfected the internationalist system, the ideology. We can then export it through, institutions like Hollywood and Western forms of cultural domination over the third world. So that's all I have to say today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to speaking with you again next time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.